Good morning, students. I am Shaila Goel. Today we are going to learn more about learning as given by Ivan Pavlov. He gave us classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian psychologist born in 1849 who had abandoned his orthodox Christian career and instead devoted his life to science after making several remarkable discoveries. He later went on to complete his Nobel Prize winning research on digestion using the dogs when he accidentally discovered Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov started from the idea that there are some things that dogs do not need to learn, for instance, salivating when they see food. The lab technician who fed Pavlov's dog wore lab coats. Pavlov found that the dog started salivating even when no food was in sight. Pavlov wondered why the dogs salivated when they saw the lab coats, not just the food. He ran a study in which he rang a bell every time he fed the dogs, and soon he found that just ringing a bell made the dogs salivate. Now, to understand this more, let us understand this. Classical conditioning is a form of learning in which neutral stimuli, the conditioned stimuli, in the first case it was a lab coat, it was neutral, it did not elicit the response of saliva. And in the second case, where he conditioned the food with the bell is the conditioned stimuli because it is neutral and it does not elicit the रिस्पॉन्स ऑफ सलाइवा. नॉर्मली जो लैब कोट होता है या बेल होता है बेटा, उससे हमें सलाइवा नहीं आता, ये न्यूट्रल है. और इनको हमें कंडीशन कर दिया फूड के साथ तो ये कंडीशन स्टिमुलाई बन जाते हैं. इज पेयर्ड विद द अनकंडीशन स्टिमुलाई. अनकंडीशन स्टिमुलाई इज दैट स्टिमुलाई विच विल एलिसिट द रिस्पॉन्स. फॉर एग्जाम्पल फूड से हमें भी सलाइवा आता है, डॉग को भी आता है, वो हमारा अनकंडीशन स्टिमुलाई है. Okay, that is unlearned or unconditioned response. And what is the unconditioned response to the food? That is saliva. As a result, the CS comes to elicit a conditioned response. Now the saliva that comes due to the lab coat or due to the presence of the bell, that is saliva again, but it is the response to the lab coat or to the bell. This is because the CS becomes a signal that UR will be followed. In our mind, we make this connection that UCR or the unconditioned stimulus will come. Okay, that is why there is a response. Now, in this setup, the dog was kept hungry, okay, for the course of the experiment. And Pavlov, what he did do, he kept the dog on a harness with the tube attached to the dog's jaw on one end and measuring jar on the other end. Then what happened? He used to ring a bell, and after the bell, the food was presented. Slowly, what did he observe? He observed that as soon as the bell rang, the dog started salivating. Why did it happen? Because the dog became conditioned to believe that the ringing bell meant that the food was coming. Right? See, students, we have to understand the terms, and now for this, let us understand the science behind the Pavlov's jaw, and we understand the terms clearly. First is unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that naturally, unconditionally, and automatically triggers a response. In this, the saliva, when we see the food, is the unconditioned stimulus. UCR is the unconditioned response, is the unknown response that occurs naturally in terms to the unconditioned stimulus. When you see the food, saliva comes. This is unconditioned response. When you see the robbers, some fear enters into you. That fear is unconditioned response. Next is conditioned stimulus. In the stage 3 of Pavlov experiments, what happens? The bell is triggered with the food, right? Now, conditioned stimulus is previously neutral stimulus that, after being associated with UCS, eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response, that is saliva, right? So, bell becomes a conditioned response because it is associated with food, and it elicits the response of saliva. Now, conditioned response, when afterwards, after conditioning, when Pavlov did not present a dog with the food, he only rang the bell. He saw without the food also the saliva comes out. This is the conditioned response. Conditioned response is the learned response to the previously neutral stimuli, which, after being associated with USS, eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response. So, the bell, when it generates saliva, it becomes a conditioned stimulus, and saliva becomes a conditioned response. Now, let's revise it. In the stage 1, the food is presented and saliva comes out. The food is the UCS, that is unconditioned stimulus, whereas the salivation is unconditioned response. Okay, they come naturally. Stage 2, when the bell responds, what is the response to the bell? There is no response because it is neutral. But in the stage 3, repeatedly, in the many trials, the bell comes first, followed by the food, and what it is observed, the seeing of the food triggers the response of the saliva. But in the mind, the dogs are associating bell with the food. Eventually, what happens in the stage 4 is, when the bell is rung separately, then also there is a condition that the food will be followed. That is why the dog started salivating without the sight of the food, that is just on ringing the bell, and it becomes a conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Now, my dear students, let us see the examples or that is affected into our day-to-day life. Little Albert, classical conditioning of fear response. Now, how we can condition a fear response to a thing? We can see by the example of little Albert. Little Albert was a small boy, and whenever he used to touch the furry rabbit, there used to be a banging with the metal and the hammer, and there was a loud noise, and this led to the conditioned response to rats as well as any furry object. That is why little Albert started fearing all the soft toys, rabbit, rats, etc. Now, for example, when you hear an ice cream truck, you know the bell of the ice cream truck, and when you have not seen the ice cream truck and even just heard the voice, what will happen? You will run out and wait for the truck. Before that, when you have not associated that bell with the ice cream truck, you will never go out to wait for the ice cream van or the ice cream person. You will just do that when you have started associating that bell with the ice cream, okay, with the arrival of the ice cream truck or the cycle or something. This shows that we can generate responses by associating the stimulus. This is also known as SS learning, stimulus learning. Now, determinants of classical conditioning. My dear students, there is a time relationship between stimulus. For in the classical conditioning, there are 3 forward conditioning and 1 backward conditioning. First is simultaneous conditioning, when the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus is presented together. Okay, it requires more number of trials. To explain this, let us see the situation where food and the bell is presented together. Bell continues till the food is there. Okay, the bell starts when the food is presented and ends till the food ends. Right? This is the case of simultaneous conditioning. The other is delayed conditioning. The onset of CS precedes the onset of the US, and the CS ends before the end of the US. The conditioning is most effective. In the example of food and bell, we can say that the bell starts, and as soon as the bell starts, the food also arrives. But the dog keeps on eating, the food is there, and the bell stops before the food finishes. This is the situation of delayed conditioning. You can say it in your recess time also. As soon as the bell rings, you take out your lunchbox. The bell stops and you keep on eating. This is known as delayed conditioning. Next is trace conditioning. Trace conditioning means the onset and the end of the CS precedes the onset of US with the time gap between them. This condition requires more number of trials. For example, the bell rings and it stops. After few seconds, the food arrives. So the CS has already came and gone, and after that it was followed by UCS. This is trace conditioning. Backward conditioning is the most difficult one, where the US precedes the onset of the CS. That means the food is presented before the bell. It is the least effective one, okay, to acquire the conditioned response. Type of unconditional stimuli. See, the unconditioned stimuli is of two types, appetitive and aversive. Appetitive is related to the taste, like eating, drinking. It is slow and requires many trials. For example, if you associate a very bad taste with the alcohol, what will happen? Slowly and steadily you will not eat, right? To tasting and drinking, and if you feel sick after eating something, what will happen? Once you will ignore, but if it happens twice or thrice, you will not ignore, and there will be a conditioning. Aversive is those stimuli which are not very good, right? For example, noise, bitter taste, etc. In the little Albert case, there was a loud hammering, and that hammering caused a fear response, that is aversive. If you touch an electric board and you get the current, that will be an aversive conditioning, right? Now, intensity of the conditioned response stimuli. More intense in conditioned stimuli are more effective in accelerating the acquisition of CR. Supposing little Albert touched the furry rabbit, and the hammering is very light, and it does not disturb little Albert. Will it be effectively conditioned? Will there be a fear response? No, my dear students. It will not elicit the fear response because the intensity is very low. The intensity is very much important. For example, you are feeling hungry and your mom gives you one bite of chapati. Will it be an effective conditioning? No, because that amount of food, you will not do anything for that amount of food, right? The right quantity of food or the right amount of noise is required for the conditioned stimuli. If the intensity is less, it will be ineffective. Thank you, students. I hope you have understood the classical conditioning. It is the very simplest form of conditioning and very important. Thank you.